We call our programs Travels and Traditions, and for good reason. For over 40 years, I have been traveling around the world looking at local traditions and trying to understand what is going on here. Why do the people of China, the world epicenter for tea drinking, drink tea in cups without handles? And people in the West have handles on their teacups. Do the Chinese tea drinkers know something we don't? Why do the people of England drive on the left side of the road and most other nations drive on the right? Why do people in Europe and the Americas say bless you when someone sneezes and people in Asia don't? Travels and Traditions is about traveling around the world and trying to find the answers to questions like these. It's also about spotting cultural trends and trying to find out why. When I first started traveling in Europe and visiting museums, stealing great works of art was rather unusual, but that is no longer the case. Each year, over $6 billion worth of art and antiques are stolen, and much of it is used by organized crime to fund drug deals, arms sales, and terrorists. A stolen work of art is a stolen piece of our history. Today, worldwide, in terms of value, it's the third biggest crime. So when did the mob learn about Macys? As I travel around, certain trends stand out as universal. They may be more pronounced in one culture and less significant in another, but you can clearly feel the movement and the direction. When I first started traveling by plane in the 1940s, all pilots were men. Today, about half my flights are piloted by women. Same for the doctors who keep me up and running. At least half of them are now women. My mother was one of the first women executives in Macys Department store in New York City, and she had to learn everything on the job. My wife has an MBA and an advanced degree in sustainable business practices. I began to think about how things had changed for women in business and how some things had not changed. I decided to get on the road and find out what I could find out. And my first stop was Greenwich, Connecticut. When did women start wrestling?
Women were wrestling for a long, long time.
I wanted to talk to a woman who had achieved considerable success in a field dominated by men. So I went to see Linda McMahon. Linda is the co-founder and former chief executive officer of World Wrestling Entertainment. She started with an idea and built it into a publicly traded global enterprise with more than 800 employees.
Vince and I were married when I graduated from high school, and I went all through college. And the day we graduated from college, I found out I was pregnant with our first child, most untimely. I graduated from college with a degree in French. I was going to be a French teacher. So starting any kind of a career, even just paying the bills, got put on the back burner for a while. But I did get a job in Washington, D.C. at the law firm of Covington and Burling as a receptionist. And sometimes, lady luck is on your side. You're in the right place at the right time. And there was a client at the firm, Ezra Pound, who passed away in France. Some of the correspondence coming in earlier in the morning, they need a little translating with before the international department opened. And I kind of got a foothold in the probate division and enjoyed that. And Covington and Burling trained me as a paralegal in their probate division. So it gave me a real insight into intellectual property and what all that meant.
I felt that if I was going to understand the traditions around women at work, I should have a woman working with me. So I asked Linda to join me and split the work.
We headed off to Columbia University to talk to Alice Kessler Harris. Alice is a professor of American history at Columbia University in New York City and a former president of the Organization of American Historians. She's written a number of books about the history of women in America, and most important for us, many of those books were about women and work. It seems that a major shift began when women started doing what they did at home, but in factories. Historically, women's work and men's work have been separated. women tended to work in and around the home and men outside. But during the past few generations, that has been changing. We see men doing more jobs that were associated with women, nursing, childcare, elementary school teaching, and women moving into jobs that have previously been associated with men, like law, medicine, and architecture.
So whereas women had been the spinners and the weavers in their homes, now they become the spinners and the weavers in the factories. Whereas they had educated small children in their homes, they become the dame school teachers, the infant school teachers later.
And it gets more pronounced during wartime.
In the Civil War, women went to work as nurses, which they had not done in large numbers before. They had nursed, but nursed mostly in family and community settings. In the Civil War, women went to work as clerks in offices and worked for the first time for the federal government. The First World War produced something of the same effect. It wasn't as long and it didn't demand as many workers, so women's gains were subsequently far less proportionally than they had been during the Civil War. That is, women went to work in jobs that formerly had been classified as male jobs. The one that always comes to mind is streetcar operators. So the streetcars had been operated by men generally because it was considered unladylike, unfeminine for a woman to mingle so freely with the public and to be exchanging cash and touches and so on with men. But during the war, the men were off in the war and male labor was expensive and men could get better jobs, so they hired women to be streetcar workers. After the war, of course, the men come back, their labor is not so expensive. Women working as streetcar operators is still seen as a little offbeat, and they try to fire the women workers. Eventually they succeed, but not before the women resist mightily. They go to court, they demand to keep their jobs, but they're told, literally by the courts, they're told that these jobs are not really appropriate for women. But the big progress made by women was that it became acceptable during the war to hire women to work as office staff. The early typewriters were first operated by men, not by women. And then when it became clear that they could as easily be operated by women and that their labor would of course be less expensive, women began to be hired.
In Washington, the commander of the newly formed Women's Army Auxiliary Corps begins her duties. A housewife and mother, she will direct an army of 250,000 women. Women who will work behind the lines, relieving more men for combat duty in the field.
One way or another, during the Second World War, over 18 million women were involved in the war effort.
Basic training doesn't take long, only a month, and your pay begins at once. You learn to take orders and to carry them out. You acquire new vigor, new confidence. You learn to march with others and to work with others.
The Coast Guard made a pretty good recruiting film, pointing out the important tasks to be done by women.
These are the jobs which must be done by spars. Movement of ships and men, entrusted to paper, is also entrusted to you.
Yes, the spars have a job to do too. Perhaps our jobs are not, for the moment, so exciting as sending a depth charge over a cutter's side or seeing a telltale oil slick rise from a blasted sub, but they are vital jobs which must be done. Vital jobs done by women so that men may fight.
Now, a man can go to sea. You take over his job with the same rating, the same pay, the same privileges, and the same responsibilities.
But then they couldn't resist putting in this idiotic segment.
You won't get to be an admiral, but you may be the admiral's secretary.
Just for the record, these days the Navy and the Coast Guard have a total of 55 women admirals.
Most people believe that World War II had a great impact on the role of women in work, but that may not have been the case. We went to Washington to talk to Liz Maurer. Liz is at the National Women's History Museum.
Government very actively encouraged women to participate. Now, the primary way that they wanted women to participate was really through activities like volunteerism. Right? And then, in addition to volunteerism, they wanted to recruit women to go into the workplace. They also wanted to recruit women to go into the military. So there's a lot of different ways that women could make contributions, right? But these women during World War II were still living in a culture that had very definite expectations about what the roles of men and women should be. So for 150 years prior, the notion had taken hold that the American family should be made of a breadwinner husband and a homemaker mom.
Women have joined the men in the production lines, and the percentage of women in industry is expected to be much higher very soon.
We think of World War II as a time when vast numbers of women flooded into the workplace and changed the way that women worked, or changed the way that culture viewed women at work. And that actually didn't happen. There were women who were already in the workplace who just kind of switched their jobs from one type of a job to more of a war production job.
The primary way that women were expected to contribute to the war effort was not working outside of the home, but going back home and doing the very same things that you did every day.
But we can't forget that the way that women were overwhelmingly expected to support the war effort was by not going into the workforce. And while there was a tremendous campaign that would encourage women to do that, there was an equally large, if not larger, campaign that was launched to encourage women to stay home and to support the war effort by doing more of the same kinds of activities that they'd always done.
Now for the real garden.
They were encouraged to grow victory gardens, home canned foods for their family, bake cakes for soldiers as they moved through the country to their deployment areas, and volunteer at the local USO.
The Red Cross created this vast volunteer network for women to do things that were actually not even necessary. So while there were women who rolled bandage after bandage after bandage, it was really a make-work activity designed to keep women feeling like they were engaged in supporting the war effort without actually contributing to the war effort. Because it would have been a lot more sanitary and efficient to have machines roll bandages rather than having the ladies get together in the church basements to do that.
Evidently, World War II was not a time of great progress for all women, and in fact, the war often reinforced traditional gender roles. But there were some great exceptions.
On August 5th, 1943, the United States Air Force created the WASPs, which stood for Women's Air Force Service Pilots. There were over 1,000 female pilots in the group, and they flew over 60 million miles utilizing every type of military aircraft. 38 of those women gave their lives defending our country.
The most prevalent image of women supporting the war was Rosie the Riveter, and over the years she became a symbol of women's economic power. Her job was to encourage young women to go out and get a factory job. Rosie the Riveter had a far different significance in the 1940s than she does today, and I think she's an example of how wartime propaganda did a job then that we're still being affected by today.
So that particular image of the woman with the colorful headscarf, and she's holding up her sleeves. You can kind of see that she's got a nice little muscle going. And her job was to encourage young women to go out and get factory jobs. But if you take a very close look at her image, you'll see that she's being aimed to send particular kinds of messages. She is very pretty. She's wearing this fabulous scarf around her hair. There's this cute little curl popping out, and she's wearing makeup. And if you take a good look, it's her left hand that's kind of rolling up her sleeve, and there is no sign of a wedding ring on that finger, right? So she's this young woman who's going to go into a factory, is not going to let it affect her femininity in any way, shape, or form. And then when she's done, she's ready to go back home again.
All the day long, whether rain or shine, she's a part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory. Rosie, the riveter, keeps a sharp lookout.
Rosie was based on a number of people, including Rosalind P. Walter, a woman of considerable wealth who decided to work the night shift building Corsair fighter planes. Eventually, Rosalind became a devoted philanthropist, a board member of WNET, the public television station in New York, and a longtime supporter of the Charlie Rose Show.
She was as proud as a girl could be.
In 1943, the Memorial Day cover of the Saturday Evening Post featured an illustration by Norman Rockwell that made Rosie a national icon. Rockwell has Rosie in penny loafers, with one foot on top of a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf. Her pose matches that of the prophet Isaiah, painted in 1509 by Michelangelo on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Picasso once said, "Good artists copy, great artists steal." That was also a sign in the office of Steve Jobs.
The more feminine version of Rosie without the riveting gun became more popular in the 70s and 80s, more of an example of the women's liberation movement. Today, she is a symbol for women that says, we're going to stay in the workforce and we're going to do these things because we can. Very different from how this image was interpreted in 1942.
A new movement for women's liberation is launched, and once again protesters take to the street to support their demands for total freedom, economically, politically, socially.
Rosie was just the tip of the iceberg for the feminist movement. In the early 1960s, the second wave began with women following in the footsteps of Rosie, but taking the movement much further. Women like Gloria Steinem debated equality issues ranging from equal pay to family roles to reproductive rights and sexuality.
What we are talking about is a revolution and not a reform.
Steinem documented mistreatment by men in a diary she kept while she was working undercover as a Playboy bunny. The need for a focused movement advocating equality became stronger as women began infiltrating pop culture and the media. Take Helen Reddy's song, "I Am Woman." Next was a visit to Zurich. Zurich is the largest city in Switzerland. It's famous for its shopping streets, its sculptured cows, its local food, its chocolate, and its clocks and watches. They even have the most complex clock ever made. It demonstrates the movement of our solar system in real time, and it's guaranteed to do it for 25,000 years. So if you buy it, put your receipt in a safe place. Zurich, however, is probably most famous for its banks, and they are watching everything. This is the head office of Credit Suisse, one of the world's largest banks. And this is Stefano Natala, the head of global equity research at the investment banking division of Credit Suisse.
Stefano directed a study of 28,000 senior managers at 3,000 companies worldwide. The study clearly indicated that the more women in senior management positions within a company, the better the company's financial performance.
So what we found is that companies with a high percentage of women in management had, high return on equity, and they had higher valuations versus the one with a lower percentage of women in the top management. What is startling is that there is a very strong association between the performance of the stocks and the performance of the stocks and the percentage of women. The question obviously is better companies have more women in top management, or women decide to work for better companies. It's difficult to distinguish which one of the two of these two issues is the driving force behind that. But what is unequivocal is the data. The data don't lie, right? When we look at the data, is companies with a high percentage of women in top management are performing better than the ones with a lower percentage of women in top management.
The conclusions from the Credit Suisse study are pretty clear. The more women in top management, the better the company's financial performance and the higher the return on equity. Also, the more women in management, the less fear of risk.
Where do you come from?
Even Batgirl became a feminist icon. She jumped in during the 1960s with this public service announcement for the U.S. Department of Labor.
Holy breaking and entering! It's Batgirl!
Quick, Batgirl, untie us before it's too late.
It's already too late. I've worked for you a long time, and I'm paid less than Robin.
Holy discontent!
Same job, same employer means equal pay for men and women.
No time for jokes, Batgirl.
It's no joke. It's the federal equal pay law.
Holy act of Congress!
Can we talk about this later?
Will Batgirl save the dynamic duo? Will she get equal pay? Tune in tomorrow.
It took a while, but Batgirl did finally get equal pay.
The U.S. Department of Labor.
Before we conclude this program, we owe you the answers to 3 questions. When the Chinese first started drinking hot tea, they realized that there was a real chance of burning the inside of your mouth. By holding the cup directly in your hand, you find out if the tea is too hot to drink. A cup handle prevents you from getting that information. The Chinese way is safer.
Knights on horseback liked a free right hand for fighting, so they kept to the left. In the 1700s, teamsters in the United States and France would sit on the left rear horse, so they kept to the right. Gave them a better view when they passed another wagon. Napoleon spread keep to the right travel to the countries he conquered. The English and their colonies held on to keep left.
During the 1300s, about 25% of the population of Europe died of the Black Plague. People thought that the first sign of the plague was a sneeze, and so they would say, "May God bless you and protect you from the plague." The sneeze idea didn't take hold in Asia, where sneezing is just a sneeze.
So keep to the right, get teacups without handles, and keep saying, "Bless you."
And please join us next time for more Travels and Traditions. I'm Burt Wolfe.
And I'm Linda McMahon.
Whenever we edit one of our programs, we always end up with more good material than we can fit in. Interviews, stories, recipes. So we decided to put them on our website, burtwolfe.com. Stolen, and much of it is used by organized crime to fund drug deals, arms sales, and terrorists. A stolen work of art is a stolen piece of our history. Today, worldwide, in terms of value, it's the 3rd biggest crime. So when did the mob learn about Macys? As I travel around, certain trends stand out as universal. They may be more pronounced in one culture and less significant in another, but you can clearly feel the movement and the direction. When I first started traveling by plane in the 1940s, all pilots were men. Today, about half my flights are drive on the right. Why do people in Europe and the Americas say "bless you" when someone sneezes, and people in Asia don't? Travels and Traditions is about traveling around the world and trying to find the answers to questions like these. It's also about spotting cultural trends and trying to find out why. When I first started traveling in Europe and visiting museums, stealing great works of art was rather unusual, but that is no longer the case. Each year, over $6 billion worth of art and antiques are piloted by women. Same for the doctors who keep me up and running. At least half of them are now women. My mother was one of the first women executives in Macys Department store in New York City, and she had to learn everything on the job. My wife has an MBA and an advanced degree in sustainable business practices. I began to think about how things had changed for women in business and how some things had not changed. I decided to get on the road and find out what I could find out. And my first stop was Greenwich, Connecticut. When did women start wrestling?
Women were wrestling for a long, long time.
I wanted to talk to a woman who had achieved considerable success in a field dominated by men. So I went to see Linda McMahon. Linda is the co-founder and former chief executive officer of World Wrestling Entertainment. She started with an idea and built it into a publicly traded global enterprise with more than 800 employees.
Vince and I were married when I graduated from high school, and I went all through college. And the day we graduated from college, I found out I was pregnant with our first child, most untimely. I graduated from college with a degree in French. I was going to be a French teacher. So
we call our programs Travels and Traditions, and for good reason. For over 40 years, I have been traveling around the world looking at local traditions and trying to understand what is going on here. Why do the people of China, the world epicenter for tea drinking, drink tea in cups without handles? And people in the West have handles on their teacups. Do the Chinese tea drinkers know something we don't? Why do the people of England drive on the left side of the road and most other nations